Good evening. I hope everybody had a fine afternoon. We're continuing our series on Christian responsibilities. I think, don't hold me to this, but I think we only got one more after this. Granted, on responsibilities, we could probably almost preach an entire year of responsibilities. But I want to take, I think it was 5 lessons in total. And tonight, I want to look at Christians' responsibilities in the home. Now, we talked about to the home, but now we're going to go into the home and look at responsibilities there. A Christian was a part of a home before he or she ever became a Christian. In other words, we all come from homes long before we became Christians. And being a Christian does not lessen our responsibility to our homes, but rather increases our responsibilities and enhances it, if you will. So as Christians, there are certain things that one must help in maintaining our homes or maintaining a Christian home that we are responsible for, and that's what we're going to look at here tonight. The first one I want to point out is that as a Christian, we're responsible to help establish peace in the home. Again, we are responsible to help establish peace in the home. Now, we've probably seen on TV, we've probably seen on probably mainly on TV, maybe read in books, maybe even listened to on radio programs or heard talk shows about, where households they seem to be like World War III. Somebody's always fighting and bickering with somebody. But that's not how a Christian home ought to be ran. That's not to say that there's never disagreement. That's not the case. But, but within that family circle, it's not a fighting ring. In other words, we shouldn't foster an environment where there's constant bickering, fighting, and that type of thing. Consider Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 19, where it says, "It's better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and angry woman." Of course, now these are proverbs, and these are just pearls of wisdoms. But the idea there, it'd be better to be out, not to be in a home or in the shelter at all, if you're constantly arguing and bickering with your spouse. And in Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 24, it is better to dwell in a corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a contentious woman. Now, of course, we're not just picking on women. But again, we don't want to be at odds with one another. This is the idea. When we're constantly fighting and bickering amongst one another, that wears on people, that wears on their spirituality, and it sets a bad example for the young ones within the home. All families have disagreements, but we don't need to let them degenerate into strife. That's where it goes too far. There's always going to be disagreements on what to fix for supper or what to have for supper, or what to do that week, what's the priority, what should be the priority, what's not the priority. There's whenever you bring two people together, there's going to be disagreement at some point, is there not? But the key is not to let those disagreements degenerate into animosity, into strife, into complete anger and hatred towards one another. That's not the good thing. That's not the good example, if you will. All must work at it, and this is not a 50-50 proposition. My father used to always want to use this word 50-50. Did he not? Whenever there was an altercation between me and my brother, it was always 50-50. The reason why I'll have you understand now, I was about 90% innocent, and it was all my brother's fault, but my father always said it was 50-50. But in actuality, when it comes to keeping peace within the home, it's not 50-50 proposition. In other words, it's not half my responsibility, it's not half your responsibility. Well, instead, what we ought to be looking at it as, it's 90% my responsibility and it's 90% your responsibility. In other words, we should be both working very hard to keep the disagreements to a minimum. In other words, we don't want warring families. So a family should in other words, the family or the home should be a haven from the strife-torn world that we live in. In other words, children should be able to come home and not fear that, what are mom and dad going to be fighting about tonight, or what's going to be what's my big brother and big sister going to be worrying about. They shouldn't have those concerns. What they should be doing is looking forward to coming home, having some peace and some tranquility, if you will, within the confines of the home. So this is one of our, I would argue, one of our primary responsibilities in the home is to help establish peace within the home and foster a good, positive environment, one that is free from strife. Next, I want to consider that we are responsible to help establish love within the home. Now, we did talk about love the last time somewhat. We talked about that there was 3 types of love. And I think the biggest takeaway is that love can be taught. I think this is something that the world sometimes misunderstands about love within the home or love within the marriage. But love can be taught. I mean, it was commanded that the older woman teach the younger woman how to love their husbands. I mean, that's what Paul told Timothy. So does that, in other words, it can be taught. So husbands, wives, and children are all commanded to love one another. Now, we can probably argue back and forth what concept of love, but we have to go to the scriptures. We all want to take away our own idea of love. And remember, often what is spoken of love within the scriptures is that agape love, that willingness to not necessarily fulfill every wish, want, and fantasy that one has, but that sense of love that you would do anything for that individual, even put forth your life in order to save them. But we see in Ephesians 5:25 that says, "Husbands, love your wives, just like Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her." How did Christ love the church? He gave his life for the church, right? He hung upon the cross so that the church might be established. Titus 2:4 says that they admonished the young women to love their husbands, to love their children. Here, again, admonish, the idea of teaching young women to love their children and to love their husbands. In Ephesians 6:2, it says, "Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment, which is the promise." This is given to children, to honor. That would be to love them. Love is known by what it does. And if we go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, which is often referred to as the love chapter, if you will, we see that love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself. Love is not puffed up. Love does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. That's what love, that's the Bible definition of what love is. Notice that, that definition does not talk about a 100-inch TV or the most up-to-date game system or a supercomputer that will, connect to whatever browser that you want. It speaks of nothing about materialism, does it not? In this world, people, I think, often associate love with materialism. Do I have the biggest car? Do I have the biggest ring? Do I have the biggest of this? Do I have the biggest of that? And that's the furthest thing from what love actually is when we look to the scriptures. And so, yeah, sometimes houses become war torn because we have a perverted sense of what love is. Parents love their children enough to provide for them. Okay, so again, this idea of love is not often what we think as of love. We might think of love as being that hug and that kiss that we get before we get onto the school bus, and that it certainly is a type of love. Don't get me wrong. But here, what we're seeing commanded is to provide for them, to set them up for success. Another, rear them in a right way, in admonition of the Lord, so that they might grow up and prosper themselves. And often that might mean not fulfilling every wish and want that they want, that they desire, but actually, as the proverb writer says, spare the rod, spoil the child. 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 14 says, "Now for the third time I am ready to come to you, and I will not be burdensome to you, for I do not seek yours, but you. For the children ought not to lay up for the parents, but the parents for the children." So if we love our children enough, we will provide for them. We will provide them instruction. We will provide a good home for them. We will provide an environment which they might flourish, not flourish from a material aspect, but flourish from a spiritual aspect, so that they might grow up and continue in the ways of the Lord. And then on the opposite side of that, children are to love their parents enough to provide for them when needed. Consider 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 18. "For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. The laborer is worthy of its wages." And then Matthew chapter 15, verses 4 through 6, "For God commands, saying, honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, whoever says to his father or mother, what profit you might have received from me is a gift to God, then he need not honor his father or mother. Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition." Now, we often talk about this as an example how the Pharisees would pervert the law. And in this case, what it was is that, even under the Mosaical system, it was set up that when, at some point, everybody becomes feeble enough in their lives that they need assistance later on in life. And the idea was that children, after you raised your children, they become prosperous, or that they went out on their own once you became of an age. This is back long before Social Security and other institutions that were established, but that you would look out for your parents later on in life, just as they watched out for you earlier in life. But the Pharisees created this thing that says, well, to get you out of this, because, people didn't want to take care of their parents, they came up with this scheme that says, well, why don't you give to the temple? And then we'll say, well, you've given what you've gained, or you've given a gift, if you will, to God. So therefore, you're not obligated to honor your father and your mother, because you've honored God. And then that's what Christ was saying, is that you've nullified God's commandment of taking care of your parents through your traditions. So it was always intended for children to look out for their parents in later years. Now, granted, like I said, there's a lot of programs out there. There's retirement programs, there's 401ks, there's investments. There's a lot of things that parents can do to not become a financial burden upon their children later on in years. And I think we certainly have that obligation as parents to seek out those things. But those things always don't work out as intended. There are people who maybe rape is wrong, pilfer and pillage those funds, if you will. There's been many retirement funds that have gone broke because of investors, playing loose with the money. And you thought that you was going to retire with some money just to find out that your funds manager had squandered it all. In the same way, people, have entrusted others with their money to invest it wisely in the market just to find out that they didn't invest it wisely, that they invested it in high risk stocks that didn't pay out, and now all that money's gone. So maybe your parents tried to look out for you and tried it, but it didn't work out because they were taken advantage of, not because of their fault, but because of the deceptions of others. The point is that God always intended for the parents to provide for the children early on in their lives, and then for the children to provide for the parents later on in their lives. And we need to keep that same pattern here yet today. The next responsibility that we see that we ought to do within the home is to help establish God's order. We have a responsibility to establish and maintain God's order. The Christian wife will respect the Christian life will respect the husband's place within the home. When we look to the scriptures, we see that the husband is the head of the home. Over in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 23, it says, "For the husband is the head of the wife, for as also Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body." And then in 1 Timothy 3:5 it says, "For if a man does not know how to rule his house, his own house, how will he take care of the church of God?" If we consider that. So the man is the head of the household. That doesn't mean, we talked a little bit about this. This doesn't mean that he rolls with an iron fist, or it doesn't mean that people grovel before him and that type of thing. But no, but as the head, as the CEO, if you will, of the house, that's where the ultimate say or decision making rests, is upon that head. Ultimate, and God will hold that individual responsible for that position. They are to be the primary provider for the home. Over in Titus chapter 2:5, we see that the men are to be discreet, women are to be discreet, chaste homemakers, good, obedient to their husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. The Christian husband will honor his wife's place within the home. He will honor her as the weaker vessel. Where we see over in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7, we see husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel. This idea of weaker vessel, it just means that she is, we understand even in today's this transgenderism and these things, where those in the secular world are trying to pervert the sexes, if you will. They want to open up sports for a man to participate in women's sports if they identify as a woman. But we know from a biological aspect, as God created them, that the male of the species is the stronger, more robust built body, if you will. They have more bone density, and they actually carry more muscle on their body than what that of a woman. So that's what it means here by the weaker vessel. It's not saying that she is weak. That's not the case. But in general, women are the weaker of the two sexes. So being that as it may, is that the husband ought to love to honor her as the weaker of the two sexes, and as being heirs together in the grace of God. We know that Paul taught that when we get to heaven, there's neither male nor female. So we're both co-heirs as far as that goes. Um, and then we see that, we need to do this so that our prayers may not be hindered. And so we need to honor her as the weaker vessel, if you will. In Ephesians 5:28, it says, so husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. So I often say, I don't know anybody who rails against his own body or does things to his body just to be doing things, just to be mean to oneself. Now I understand there's some people that are mentally ill that might bring harm to themselves, but in general, people usually don't harm themselves, but they will hurt and harm others. But that would not be the case for how God would have it. Over in Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 18, it says that wives, submit to your husbands as it is fitting to the Lord. So we need to honor our wives, honor her as the mother of her children and as the manager of the home. 1 Timothy 5:14 says, therefore desire that the young widows marry, bear children, manage the homes, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproach. So being a manager of the home. I know in the Air Force, when things ran properly, people were appointed to be managers over different departments, over different offices, if you will. And usually the commanding officers stayed out of their business, if you will, and let them manage how they saw fit. That's why they were appointed for those positions. If he always had his fingers in there trying to, we call that micromanaging. So I don't think husbands ought to micromanage the home. While they may be the ultimate decision maker, that doesn't mean that we sit there and we tell everybody how to do each and every task that needs to be done, because it just drives people crazy, if you will. So what's the takeaway here is that the wife is neither the head of the husband. In other words, she's not in charge, I guess, if you will. But she's also not his doormat, something to wipe his feet off and pander to him every time he comes home. But instead, they are to be of one flesh, are they not? And Adam was not taken from the head, he was not taken from the foot, but he was taken from the side of man. And so then, therefore, we need to treat our spouses rightly and justly, just as God would have us to do. Again, Christ does not rule over the church like a dictator, does he? No. He set out his law. He said, this is what you ought to do. And then he lets you carry it out. That's probably how the house ought to be ran as well. Again, husbands that are authoritarians or dictators and whatnot, I don't see any room within the scriptures for any such behavior. But again, those individuals will be held accountable. It's not for me to hold them accountable. It's for Christ, or they'll face judgment in those days. A Christian child will respect the parents' rights to command and discipline. This has been the age-long struggle that kids often don't understand why parents, you're just being mean to me. I want to go hang out with my friends over at this place, this alley or whatnot. Parents knowing full well what usually takes place there isn't things that Christians ought to be doing. So they say, no, you should not go over there. I don't want you to be hanging out in that type of place. Why not? You're just trying to be mean to me. You just don't want me to have any fun, blah, 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 blah. In the end, children need to respect their parents and their right to command and discipline them. Consider Colossians chapter 3 and verse 20. It says, children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. He didn't say in some things or just the things that you agree to. He says in all things. Again, children, obey your parents in all things. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 3, it says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment of promise, that it may be well and that you may live long on the earth. This we may not, like I said, we may not always understand why our parents are having us to do what we ought to do, or why they're having us to do things, but we are to respect their right in telling us what to do, and it may not always be their preferred way. In other words, we may not prefer the way that our parents have us to do things, but we respect their right to have their way as parents. So a Christian parent will respect the children's right to nurture to the nurture and admonition of the Lord. They will not be overly harsh. In other words, parents don't need to provoke their children to anger. So when they deal too harshly with them in different circumstances, this brings about bitterness, strife, those things. And then usually when they come of age, they can't wait to get out of the household, and they go out and they often repeat the same cycle of discipline that was used unto them. In other words, the abuse that was administered unto them, the recycle often gets repeated into their life because it becomes what they call learned behavior. So we need to learn not to deal with them over harshly, but to remember that the secret to discipline is to just administer enough correction to bring about the desired amount of change. It doesn't mean that we go to the 10th degree of discipline for the slightest infraction. That's not ruling. That's not being good parents. That's just being a dictator. That's being an abuser, is what that is. And then on the opposite side of it, worse yet, is to not raise them under discipline and not to train them, but to leave them just up to their own. That's the last thing that children often need. Often the happiest children are the children that live in a disciplined home. I see it every day within the school system. You can see the children that are allowed to do whatever they want, whenever they want, and however they want. They're often seeking attention, and it's usually not good attention that they're seeking. They'll take any type of attention. They often use bad means of gaining that attention, and ultimately, often it's a cry for help. But those children that are raised in a well-disciplined home, and that are trained by their parents, that parents take out time, spend time to teach them the ways of the Lord, as well as the things supplement teaching within school, those kids thrive, and those kids are happy. Those kids, when they get it back a test, they see that they got 100. A big smile comes on their face, and they're very, very happy. And when you talk to them about their parents, they're all excited, and they can't wait to tell you about what their parents did for them and what they did that week as a family. And it's rarely ever that, I got the latest and greatest Nintendo game, or that. Often it's we went and did this, or we went and did that. We went to church. It's things like that means the most to small kids. There's a right way to manage the home, and there's a wrong way to manage the home. And it's on us as Christian men and women to manage the home in a way that causes our children to flourish, because that's what God would have us to do. We need to set up for success the next generation of Christians that will usher in the world and will carry things on after we have left this world. Next, we see that I want to point out that we're responsible to help establish godliness in the home. We need to establish and maintain godliness. We let our relationship to the Godhead undergird our relationships within the home. In other words, I would argue that just as we have book, chapter, verse for everything we do in the church, we should seek to have book, chapter, verse for everything that we do within the home as well. I often say, but if we're making decisions rightly, probably the first thing we ought to do is ask, what would Jesus have me to do in this situation? So God has called us, and we look over to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15, it says, but if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage of such a case, but God has called us to peace. This is often called the Pauline exception. Christ is the head of the church. What's being spoken of here in 7:15 is that if you're unequally yoked to a non-believer, and it becomes down to the point that I don't want you to worship God, I don't want you to be a Christian, or I can't be with you if you're a Christian, well, then you let that person go. But if they will be tolerant of that, and then let our good works shine through all that, and hopes that one day they will see how it is that we behave, how that we love them, and that encourages them to say, hey, I want to be a Christian too. Christ is the head of the church, just as we over there we see the comparison between the church and the home in Ephesians 5, so we can look to there and how to manage and maintain godliness within the home. We can see again, we looked at Ephesians chapter 6 and how to raise our children in admonition of the Lord. Again, establishing godliness and maintaining godliness throughout the home. And we do this, why? Why do we want to maintain godliness within the home? It's so that our prayers may not be hindered. Look over there, we read this briefly once before, but over in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15, it says, but if the unbeliever depart, no, I'm sorry, I'm reading 7:15 again. 1 Peter 5:7, casting all your cares upon for he cares for you. That's the wrong reference, but that verse said, that we need to have good homes and be good husbands so that our prayers are not hindered. So we need to maintain godliness within the homes. Our respect for God will enhance our respect for each other within the home. That's the key takeaway. The more devout Christians we are, in other words, the more that we love God, the more that we're going to adhere to the Word of God, the more that we're going to study the Word, more that we're going to train and raise and our families within the admonition of the Lord. And so it becomes reciprocal, if you will. The more devoted we come to God, the more devoted we will come to being good husbands, good wives, and good children within the home, because that's what God would have us to do. So if we want to have good homes, it begins by being good Christians, if you will. So as we wrap things up, a home without the Lord is still a home. That's certainly true. But a home with the influence of God through His children is better than a home. It's a Christian responsibility to his Lord. Involves his responsibility to his family. In other words, yes, I don't have to be a Christian in order to have a home. But if I'm a Christian, I'm going to have a better home for my family, because I see that it's my primary responsibility to have a good home when I study the scriptures and see what God would have me to do. So that's this lesson on Christian responsibility within the home. Hope that it's been profitable for you. And now we want to extend the invitation. The invitation is your opportunity. If you're here tonight and you have not been living the life that you ought to be lived, then maybe you want to call upon the prayers of the congregation. Maybe there's something public that you need to confess or make right of. Only you know your case. Only you know your circumstances. Or if you're not a Christian, all things are ready, all things prepared if you want to become a Christian tonight. If you're subject to that gospel call in any shape, form, or manner, let it be known as we stand to sing the songs of the chosen. Someday you'll stand at the bar. Someday.